State archives in Britain are thought of as being a pristine area in which we preserve, conserve and utilise the nation's history. And most members of the public assume that that archive has everything from the past. You can go back into it, you can delve, you can find things.
The Public Records Acts of 1958 and 1967 require government departments to preserve and transfer into the public domain any documents of historical significance. If they don't do that, they're in breach of the law.
These are the National Archives. In here are government files that make up the official record of our history. Information that tells us about our shared past and how we came to know it. But are they telling us the truth? In 2009, 5 elderly Kenyan war veterans filed a case against the British government. They claimed that thousands of Kenyan nationals had been subjected to severe acts of inhumane and degrading treatment, torture and arbitrary killings in the 1950s, all at the hands of the British colonial administration. That case was to upend all our assumptions about archives and change the way we view British colonial history.
We were governed by a brutal regime. The colonial government was treating the people of Kenya very badly, like inhumans. They had also grabbed all our fertile land. They had also broken all our human rights. And therefore we were angry about that. And then we said, okay, we must liberate ourselves from this kind of regime, a dictatorship regime. Therefore we started the struggle. Initially we started the struggle through talking, through memoranda, but in the end we engaged them in armed struggle.
In the 1940s, a group of Kenyan nationals came together to oppose British colonial rule and fight for their land and freedom. This group became known as the Mau Mau. In 1952, 3 Mau Mau, disguised as policemen, publicly assassinated a senior chief who was a well-known supporter of British colonial rule. In response, London declared a state of emergency.
The Mau Mau rebellion is known generally as what historians have called a dirty war. That's to say, you have a large, well-trained, disciplined colonial army fighting a ragbag force of African militiamen who are poorly armed, untrained, unsophisticated in their methods. In such conflicts, unless the troops are extremely well disciplined, there's lots of opportunities for things to go wrong. In Kenya, the British engaged a local militia to fight against Mau Mau on their behalf. And they often put that local militia into positions where they were in the front line of the fighting. So the war becomes messy. And when these things come to light and people start protesting, as they did in the 50s about what was happening, the response of the state in Kenya, the colonial state, was to try and hush things up and to try and deny and prevent prosecutions, prevent investigations. They essentially whitewashed everything that was put to them over that 6, 7, 8 year period. But as the war went on, the misdemeanors got worse. The fighting essentially is over by the middle of 56. But from 55 to 59, they still have more than 25 to 30,000 people in detention camps. They have assumed that those 30,000 will remain in detention forever. They've told their African militia allies, the loyalists, that they will not return the rebels to their home areas. Now, during 1955 and 56, the British government in London decides that that's not tenable. You cannot do that. You have to release these people. So they are ordered to release. And in making decisions about how they're going to release these prisoners, they decide in Kenya that they cannot release prisoners who will not confess. So they set up a regime of interrogation and questioning to try and ensure that all these prisoners will confess.
While the state of emergency allowed the suspension of certain laws, including detention without trial, it did not permit torture, ill treatment, or arbitrary killings. Yet the charge that was brought in 2009 against the British government accused them of exactly that. But if these claims were true, why did it take so many decades for such things to emerge?
There was a law put in place by the colonial government. Therefore, we could not organize a Mau Mau organization because that law was there. Any government officer could arrest any one of us calling themselves Mau Mau and put them to court. They could be convicted. Therefore, we did not file a case all that time, fearing what would happen.
In the 60s and 70s, Kenyans are aware that these bad things happened. They know that there should be a prospect for redress, but the problem they have is that Kenya's government after 63 continues to hold Mau Mau as a banned movement. That means that to organise veterans associations or meetings or affiliations of Mau Mau groups is illegal. So although numerous associations spring up, they are covert. They're not allowed to meet in public. People won't admit to you that they're members. And this situation goes on until the late 1990s. One Kenyan historian has estimated that by that time there were maybe as many as 200 different Mau Mau veterans associations.
In 2003, 40 years after independence, that law was revoked by the Kibaki regime. And therefore we had a chance to file a case calling ourselves the Mau Mau.
When they became a legal entity, there were discussions around holding the colonial government accountable for the atrocities they committed when they were occupying Kenya. In 2009, the veterans were successful, supported by KHRC, to file a complaint at the Royal Court of Justice in the UK.
We were approached by organisations in, I think, mid-2000 in Kenya, saying this is what happened in Kenya, terrible events, no one's ever done anything about it, we want you to get justice on behalf of the victims. We looked at it, we said this was going to be an extraordinarily difficult case. Traditionally, you have to bring a case within 3 years. If you don't bring your case within 3 years, then you have to have very good reasons for bringing it after that time. It was pretty much unheard of for a case to be brought back as far back as the 1950s. So we said, look, we'll look at this. It's clearly a horrific set of circumstances. Justice has not been done. We will certainly try and help you. But evidently, it's going to be very difficult. And our prediction was that the case would be lost. It would be struck out at the first stage.
When the claim was launched, the British government was not so receptive.
Just to update you on what's happening with our case, the British government has applied to strike out claims of Kenyan victims of British colonial torture on the grounds of state succession. We are afraid that by seeking to invoke a legal technicality in its defence, the British government is either knowingly or unknowingly waging a war of attrition on the Mau Mau torture survivors.
The British government argued that liability would have been transferred to Kenya on independence in 1963. So if the claimants wanted to sue anyone, they must sue the Kenyan government.
We're very disappointed, given the profile of the clients and the strength, as we feel, of the case, that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is somehow delaying resolving justice for our clients.
There were issues around how responsible can the British government be responsible for the atrocities that were committed by the colonial government when Kenya was a protectorate.
We thought primarily it was going to be struck out because it was going to be impossible to get over this limitation hurdle. We thought that the government was going to successfully argue that this happened years ago, there was no good reason why the claims hadn't been brought sooner, and in view of that, the claims should not proceed.
They were defending themselves, and we said no, because Kenya government did not beat us. Kenya government did not mistreat us. We are following you because you are the people who did it. And of course, judge heard us and said the case is not going to throw out because of limitation.
For us, that's a real opportunity for these men and women who suffered despicable acts of torture to be heard. And we are calling upon the British government to really move with speed now and really settle this case. Most of these men and women are old. They're dying. We started with 5 claimants, we've already lost 1. So the sooner this is settled, the better for us.
Historians of Kenya were long ago aware that there were large gaps in the records held in Britain, where there were many kinds of records that you would have expected as a historian to find in that archive that were simply not there. When I began to consider writing about the Mau Mau Rebellion in the mid-1980s, I began looking to see what material was available both in London and in Nairobi. And in Nairobi, I discovered some documents that indicated that crates of papers had been moved from Nairobi to London at independence in 1963. Now, I became concerned about this because I realized that the quantities of documents being talked about were quite large. They talked about 6, 7, 8 crates of material. So probably 1,500, 2,000 files, something of that order. And these files referred to a selection procedure, and they referred to officers who'd conducted that procedure in Nairobi. So I knew that back in the mid-1980s. Then, in the early 1990s, documents were released in London that contained a few papers indicating that those documents sent from Kenya in '63 had been received, and that they'd arrived and that they'd been taken by the Foreign Office and moved to a repository.
Kenyans had been pushing, they pushed as early as 1968 to get access to these records. And 1968 and 1974, they were simply stonewalled. The Foreign Office makes a decision, pretty well a firm decision, that these documents are simply, quote, too hot to be returned to the Kenyans. And the Kenyans knew that these documents had gone to London, and they wanted to try and find them. And that's where, in a sense, the cover-up starts as far as the Foreign Office is concerned with the Kenyans. That's where the matter rested when the Mau Mau trial came through.
The judge in the trial, Justice Mkoon, decided that there was substantial evidence that documents had been moved to London. Therefore, the Foreign Office had to account for them. So either they had to show him that they destroyed them, which can be done legally, or they had to show him where they were. And he declared that if they didn't do one or the other, he would hold them in contempt of court. And that, in effect, would have meant we'd win the case. So he basically put a gun to their head. By that time, we'd been requesting documents from the Foreign Office for at least 6 years, probably longer, and had been told that there were no Kenyan documents available. Well, within 3 weeks, the Foreign Office had revealed that yes, they did have some documents, and in fact there were over 1,500 files relating to Kenya.
That was how they discovered this lost archive where thousands and thousands of documents from colonial era Kenya had been lost behind the sofa.
It has taken years for the full facts to come to light as a result of recent exhaustive research that's been carried out by professors not just in this country but also in Harvard. That research has shown the full scale and brutality of the abuse against the detainees and the fact that the paper trail in terms of what happened to them went all the way up to the Colonial Secretary here in the UK.
When they admitted to holding all of these files, government ministers were insisting, we'd forgotten we had them. We didn't know we had them. We didn't know they were there. But actually, the Foreign Office did know they had these files because they built the building in which they were housed. This place, Hounslow Park, a mixed MI5, MI6 and Foreign Office compound surrounded by lots of security, several fences and intruder alarms and CCTV cameras. It's a place where government scientists developed the means of securing government communications, a purpose-built archive that was opened in 1992 by a government minister.
These documents were eye-popping, to be honest with you. I spent 5-6 weeks, almost every day, something emerged from those files that surprised me. And remember that by then I'd been working on this for 30 years, so I wasn't easily shocked. But every day there were things that I found to be revelatory. The key documentation concerned decisions made in government about implementations of policies in detention camps and the treatment of persons accused of atrocities and other misdemeanors. One I would cite in particular is a file dealing with women detainees, which is a topic that has long fascinated historians but that they have not known very much about. And one of the files in the Hounslow disclosure revealed the existence of an entire detention camp in Kenya that we knew nothing about. This was a place where women prisoners were being taken for interrogation. It was a high-intensity camp. It had several hundred women detainees, and we knew not one word about it until these documents were revealed. So that's how intense and how important these documents can be to understanding processes of what happened. From those cases, I realized that the torture of prisoners was systematic and normal, and that is unquestionably demonstrated in the documents we now have.
Now there was more evidence, more supporting documentation from former colonial administrators that were giving evidence that actually torture and ill treatment was a government policy. Now we had documentation from the UK archives stating out this is what happened, this is the government policy, this is the torture that the natives were submitted to, this is what the government had instructed their officers to do. It was not only witness accounts, details, dates, perpetrators. It was very elaborate.
It kind of painted in technicolor what everyone suspected was the case. And that evidence, with the kind of rich evidential picture that then developed, wasn't fully in the public domain before. Historians had pieced things together as best they could, but this really provided a much more complete evidential picture than was previously available.
These documents proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the British government was involved. We had everything to win the case. We have evidence. We have our own people who were detained for 7 years. We had also our fathers who were broken, their arms and legs. Concrete evidence to defeat them.
The process that happened once the Foreign Office admitted they had the documents was quite interesting and slightly comical. When they sent us the first set of lists, appended to it was a shelving diagram for the entire repository. Now, I don't think they'd intended to send that to us, but what that showed us was that it wasn't just Kenyan documents on these shelves. It was the documents of all the other colonies as well. The Foreign Secretary, William Hague, a few weeks later admitted that they had the records of 37 different colonies and declared they would release them all into the public domain.
When that was being carried out, it turned out that there wasn't 8,800 files, there was more than 20,000 colonial era files, part of a larger archive of around 1.2 million files dating back to the 17th century that had been held quite unlawfully by the Foreign Office It wasn't a dirty little secret, it was a dirty, enormous secret.
This worldwide, systematic cover-up became known as Operation Legacy, and it went far beyond the removal and concealment of files.
We were also aware that in Kenya there had been a massive program of document destruction. There were huge gaps in those lists where certain kinds of files were missing. Those would be about a particular detention camp or about a particular atrocity. They'd literally been plucked out of these catalogues and destroyed.
On independence, London started sending fairly clear instructions to colonial officials saying this is what will be destroyed and this is what will be concealed. What they were concerned with was that successor governments shouldn't get their hands on any papers that dealt with 4 risks. One was that they were concerned that there shouldn't be anything handed over that would embarrass Her Majesty's government. Secondly, there shouldn't be anything that would embarrass any members of the armed forces or the police. That they shouldn't hand over anything that would reveal sources of information, and that they shouldn't hand over anything that would be used unethically by the successor government. That was the term that was used in 1961. Don't hand over anything that might be used unethically by the successor government. There were also very clear instructions about how the destruction should take place. So colonial officials were told that if you're going to destroy documents, if you're going to incinerate them, if you're going to burn them, you must scatter the ashes so that nobody can see that anything's been burnt. If you're going to dump them at sea, you have to dump them as far as practical, certainly beyond coastal waters, so that they wouldn't wash back. So there was very clear instructions which were intended to conceal not only the documentation, but conceal the act of destruction. But it went on for an awful long time. It started in the late 40s. It was still going on in the mid-70s, and it went on from everywhere from Belize to Brunei, and lots of points in between. It was a very large operation, which colonial officials themselves described as an orgy of destruction.
But Operation Legacy is not something we can comfortably confine to the time of empire.
There is a question of what were described as 13 top secret boxes. And in fact, I think there are 170 top secret files that we know existed. And when the documents are then transferred to Hanslope Park, there was a van going out of central London from the old Admiralty building twice a day with these documents. There's a very detailed inventory. And the top secret documents are there in March 91, and they're not there in September 92. They're not in the Foreign Office anywhere, and they're not at Hanslope Park. The only conclusion you can draw is that somewhere, but in that period, they were destroyed.
We may never know what was in those 13 boxes, but what was unearthed in the Hanslope disclosure was significant for the case.
What is great, because about 300 files were found which contained information that helping our case to succeed.
This is a historic judgment today which will have repercussions for years to come. Our 3 clients are delighted. It's a great shame they're not with us today. They came to Britain to give evidence in July to the court of the appalling abuse that they had suffered. This case has been going on for many years. On a number of occasions we have called on the government to resolve this issue speedily. We have made it clear time after time that all the victims seek is an apology and a fund that enables them to live out their lives in dignity.
So there were 3 aspects of the settlement, and I think the most important aspects were the statement of regret, delivered both by the Foreign Secretary in the House of Commons and by the High Commissioner in Nairobi to the victims. The second aspect was the monument that was paid for by the British government and is now in Uhuru Central Park to the victims of colonial era torture. And the third aspect was a small sum of compensation to each of the victims.
The British, our enemy, pays us 2.6 billion. The British, our great enemy, apologizes to the world for all the wrongs they did to our people in Kenya when they were here. They have also built a monument.
It was a huge joint communal effort to try and get justice on behalf of these victims. Kenyans working with people from the UK, lawyers working with activists, historians, and I think that's why it was ultimately a success.
But the settlement was not the end of the story. And one of the issues at the very heart of the case remains unresolved to this day.
As things stand, citizens of Cyprus and Kenya and Uganda and Belize can all access their colonial era files, but only if they've got the wherewithal to fly to London and travel to the National Archives, a Kew.
Now, the Kenyan government has 3 times tried to get them back. The position of the British government at the moment is that they're not prepared to facilitate that.
The documents and information are not easily accessible. And documentation in the UK that can help Kenyans have insights into their history, that can help Kenyans to learn, that can help Kenyans to avoid some mistakes that they did. If the British government can be that receptive and release this documentation, it will be a nice step. Kenyans would like to know what happened. Kenyans would like to know their history.
We want not only to be known by the British government, we want the whole world to know that Mau Mau freedom struggle, how a human being can do this to another human being. This is what we are fighting.